Chapter 30. Impact of the Agricultural Revolution on Industry, the creation of a home market for industrial capital. The intermittent but constantly renewed expropriation and expulsion of the agricultural population supplied the urban industries, as we have seen, with a mass of proletarians standing entirely outside the corporate guilds and unfettered by them. A fortunate circumstance which makes old A. Anderson, not to be confused with James Anderson, express a belief in the direct intervention of Providence in his History of Commerce. We must still pause for a moment on this element of primitive accumulation. The thinning out of the independent, self-supporting peasants corresponded directly with the concentration of the industrial proletariat, in the way that Geoffroy St. Hilaire explained the condensation of cosmic matter at one place by its rarefaction at another. But this was not the only consequence. In spite of the smaller number of its cultivators, the soil brought forth as much produce as before, or even more, because the revolution in property relations on the land was accompanied by improved methods of cultivation, greater cooperation, a higher concentration of the means of production, and so on, and because the agricultural wage laborers were made to work at higher levels of intensity, and the field of production on which they worked for themselves shrank more and more. With the setting free of a part of the agricultural population, therefore, their former means of nourishment were also set free. They were now transformed into material elements of variable capital. The peasant, expropriated and cast adrift, had to obtain the value of the means of subsistence from his new lord, the industrial capitalist, in the form of wages. And the same thing happened to those raw materials of industry which depended on indigenous agriculture. They were transformed into an element of constant capital. Suppose, for example, that one part of the Westphalian peasantry, who at the time of Frederick II all span flax, are forcibly expropriated and driven from the soil, and suppose that the other part, who remain behind, are turned into the day laborers of the large-scale farmers. At the same time, large establishments for flax spinning and weaving arise, and in these the men who have been set free now work for wages. The flax looks exactly as it did before. Not a fiber of it has changed, but a new social soul has entered into its body. It now forms a part of the constant capital of the master manufacturer. Formerly, it was divided among a mass of small producers, who cultivated it themselves and spun it with their families in small portions. Now it is concentrated in the hands of one capitalist, who sets others to spin and weave it for him. The extra labor expended in flax spinning was realized formerly in extra income to numerous peasant families, or perhaps in the time of Frederick II, in taxes for the King of Prussia. Now it is realized in profit for a few capitalists. The spindles and looms, formerly scattered over the face of the countryside, are now crowded together in a few great labor barracks, together with the workers and the raw material. And spindles, looms, and raw material are now transformed from means for the independent existence of the spinners and weavers into means for commanding them and extracting unpaid labor from them. You cannot tell from looking at the large factories and large farms that they have originated from the combination of many small centers of production and have been built up by the expropriation of many small independent producers. Nevertheless, unprejudiced observers did not allow themselves to be deceived. In the time of Mirabeau, the lion of the Revolution, the great factories were still called reunited manufactures, or workshops thrown into one, as we speak of fields thrown into one. Says Mirabeau, quote, "We only pay attention to the large-scale factories, in which hundreds of men work under a director, and which are commonly called reunited manufactures. Those where a very large number of workers work in isolation and on their own account are hardly considered worthy of a glance. They are put entirely into the background. This is a very great mistake, as the latter alone form a really important component of the national wealth. The combined workshops will prodigiously enrich one or two entrepreneurs, but the workers will only be journeymen, paid more or less according to the circumstances, and will not have any share in the success of the undertaking. In the isolated workshop, on the contrary, no one will become rich, but many workers will be comfortable. The number of hard-working and economical workers will grow, because they will see, in good conduct and in activity, a means of substantially improving their situation, and not of obtaining a small increase of wages that can never be of any importance for the future, and whose sole result is to place men in the position to live a little better, but only from day to day. The isolated individual workshops, for the most part combined with the cultivation of small holdings, are the only free ones. The expropriation and eviction of a part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital the workers, their means of subsistence, and the materials of their labor, it also created the home market. In fact, the events that transformed the small peasants into wage laborers, and their means of subsistence and of labor into material elements of capital, created at the same time a home market for capital. Formerly, the peasant family produced means of subsistence and raw materials, which they themselves for the most part consumed. These raw materials and means of subsistence have now become commodities. The large-scale farmer sells them. He finds his market in the manufacturers. Yarn, linen, coarse woolen stuffs, things whose raw materials had been within the reach of every peasant family, had been spun and woven by the family for its own use, are now transformed into articles of manufacture, the markets for which are found precisely in the country districts. Previously, a mass of small producers working on their own account had found their natural counterpart in a large number of scattered customers, but now these customers are concentrated into one great market provided for by industrial capital. Thus, the destruction of the subsidiary trades of the countryside, the process whereby manufacture is divorced from agriculture, goes hand in hand with the expropriation of the previously self-supporting peasants and their separation from their own means of production. And only the destruction of a rural domestic industry can give the home market of a country that extension and stability which the capitalist mode of production requires. Still, the manufacturing period, properly so called, does not succeed in carrying out this transformation radically and completely. It'll be remembered that manufacture conquers the domain of national production only very partially, and always rests on the handicrafts of the towns, and the domestic subsidiary industries of the rural districts, which stand in the background as its basis. If it destroys these in one form, in particular branches at certain points, it resurrects them again elsewhere, because it needs them to some extent for the preparation of raw material. It produces, therefore, a new class of small villagers, who cultivate the soil as a subsidiary occupation, but find their chief occupation in industrial labor, the products of which they sell to the manufacturers directly or through the medium of merchants. This is one cause, though not the chief one, of a phenomenon which at first puzzles the student of English history. From the last third of the 15th century, we find continual complaints, only interrupted at certain intervals, about the encroachment of capitalist farming in the country districts and the progressive annihilation of the peasantry. On the other hand, we always find that this peasantry turns up again, although in diminished number and in a progressively worse situation. The chief cause is this. England is at certain epochs mainly a corn-growing country, at others mainly a cattle-breeding country. These periods alternate, and the alternation is accompanied by fluctuation in the extent of peasant cultivation. A consistent foundation for capitalist agriculture could only be provided by large-scale industry in the form of machinery. It is large-scale industry which radically expropriates the vast majority of the agricultural population and completes the divorce between agriculture and rural domestic industry, tearing up the latter's roots, which are spinning and weaving. It therefore also conquers the entire home market for industrial capital for the first time.